Tammi Jonas. Woohoo! Yeah. Tammi is a farmer and a butcher, an activist and a researcher and writer. She is the focal point for farmers with the Australian Food Sovereignty Alliance, advocating for everyone's right to participate in decisions about food and agriculture systems locally, nationally and globally. And she's also recently this year finished a PhD on the rise of agroecology in Australia. So please welcome Tammi.
Thank you. All right. It's great to be here on Palawa country. Can I make it a little taller? Thanks. Great. I think you can hear me anyway. I have to do it for the recording. Sorry. Okay, I'm going to collect my thoughts. How many of you know that mostly I've been thinking about abattoirs for the last maybe decade? Certainly this week, it's very topical. Tomorrow I'm going to talk about that because, we've just had another one kick out the small-scale producers in Victoria just in the last week. So we'll talk about that tomorrow, though. I'm going to recenter my thoughts about Regen Ag and agroecology for now. And I'm super interested to talk with a group where there's a lot of people who probably know more about Regen Ag than they do agroecology, and how they're really similar, but how agroecology takes us further in terms of questions of justice, essentially. And how agroecology is a science, a set of practices, and a social movement. And a movement in the sense of a movement formed of organizations, not just crowds that get together every now and again. A crowd is not a movement. And it's something that in a country like Australia, where we haven't been as good at collectivizing for the several decades, we need to really think about what happens if we come together like this. What do we do next? How do we maintain momentum? How do we change the system? It's not by just turning up to something once a year to hear about really cool ideas. Like, it's actually by forming organizations and lobbying government. The reason right now we're winning, that's a very strong word, Tammi. I use it a lot, it's wrong. The reason we're gaining traction in the abattoir issue is because we have an alliance that's fighting for the changes that we want to see. And if we just turned up and talked about the problem of abattoirs, we would not be in that position. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. So agroecology is deeply related to food sovereignty. Food sovereignty asserts the right of everybody's right to nutritious and culturally determined food that's produced and distributed in ethical, ecologically sound, and socially just ways, and our right to democratically participate in the food system. Food sovereignty as a movement kind of coalesced when the World Trade Organization was established in 1995. When that happened, the peasants of the world said, wait a minute, World Trade Organization, you want to liberalize trade further. You want more free trade. That was already starting at the time, but they formed a global organization to really further the project of free trade. The smallholders around the world immediately identified that as a major risk to their ongoing viability. They knew that if the North started flooding their markets with cheap surplus from their markets, that they were going to lose their livelihoods. Here we are, 30 years later, and we know that's true. And the loss of smallholders, or what they call de-peasantization, has been speeding up for decades. So they didn't just get together and say, well, this is a problem. They got together, particularly farmers from Canada and from across South America, got together and formed what's called La Via Campesina, which means the peasant's way. La Via Campesina is the largest transnational social movement in the world. It has over 400 million signed up members of organizations who are members of La Via Campesina. And it represents several hundreds of millions more who are not signed up members. So they come together in 96. They go to the World Food Summit, the first World Food Summit. And they say, this is no good. You're coming together as elites to sort of control the food system further and say that we don't get to participate in it, that you're going to start feeding us more and more of your corporate crap, and we're not going to be able to feed our local communities. And we don't want that. We don't want free trade that makes our country so vulnerable and our livelihoods so vulnerable. So they turned up to protest the first World Food Summit. And then out of that, La Via Campesina was properly born as an international organization. Now, Australia doesn't join this food sovereignty movement until 2013, which I'll get to that in a minute. We're nearly 20 years late to the party. So in 96, they go to the World Food Summit. They form La Via Campesina. Who knows what happened in Australia in 2000 as the peasants of the world, or the smallholders of the world elsewhere, were radicalizing? What was happening here in policy, and specifically what happened in 2000? Most people know something that happened in, I'm thinking, dairy? Deregulated. So while we neoliberalized, the peasants of the South said, we're not going to take that sitting down. We're not going to let you leave this all to a free market because we know that means corporate elites will crush us all. And we're going to form stronger and stronger movements to fight back against that. And that's why, as grim as things are in a lot of those parts of the world, like I was in Sri Lanka in June, and their farmers' organizations are so strong, they're able to overturn governments, like literally, because they come together, they park on the parliament steps for 3 months, they feed 3,000 people a day to make sure they can still be there until their 2 prime ministers ago fled the country. So, and these are fierce people who are still studying Marx. That's one of the things also that I think gets forgotten, is that in the fight against communism across the West, we stopped paying attention to some really smart people who thought some very smart things about economic and political systems. And now nobody reads Marx in our countries unless you become a Marxist, but it's actually just incredible political theory. In Sri Lanka, not only did they keep reading it, and India as well, not only did they keep reading it, and they still call themselves Marxists, I sat cross-legged in a rice paddy with a 71-year-old farmer telling us about the history of agriculture and revolution and the authoritarian regimes that had put them in jail. He was in jail in 71. He was one of the few who could read English. So he translated Marx from Sinhalese into English. So his other, what do you call them, penmates, well, that's not the right word, prisoners, could read Marx as well and come out and continue the revolution when they got out of prison. And so when we were there, I heard Sri Lankans telling me that they were worried about the increasing kind of purchase of their high street shops by corporates, because that's not normal there. They still own shops. Their families still own the shops in the high streets. And so as I listened, I thought, how weird is it that we're listening to this, and back home in Australia or in America or in the UK, we sometimes say, oh, the box stores are very bad. We hate how corporates have taken over. But we've just accepted that to a large extent, we don't get to own family businesses anymore. In Sri Lanka, they don't accept that. And they just hired a really strong leftist government and are back to hopefully getting some more social programs in place. And land redistribution. Like in this country, can you imagine when you say land redistribution, everyone's like, uh-oh, are you Mao? What are we doing? Are you sending us back to the Cultural Revolution times? I'm not a big fan. I'm not a Maoist at all. But land redistribution, I think, is something we should be thinking about. So in 2007, the food sovereignty movement had grown to the extent that governments and corporations were paying attention, which means they were starting to use the language themselves. And what happens when governments and corporations start to use our language? They co-opt it, they water it down. They're basically selling food sovereignty as kind of food security, something that was not radical, not owned by the people, and a different thing. So because they're a movement, not a crowd, they went to Mali. They got organizations from the entire world to come together in 2007 and have the first Nyaleni Declaration on food sovereignty. They spent a whole week from every corner of the world except Australia, a week deciding what is our definition of food sovereignty and how can we hold to its anti-colonial, anti-capitalist, anti-patriarchal principles so that they can't take it away from us and say, we know what it is and we can sell it to you too. Because that's not what our movements do. So 2007 is the Nyaleni Declaration on Food Sovereignty. In 2015, AgroEcology is really starting to gain awareness publicly beyond the movements. It's actually a movement that's more than 3 decades old. It's a movement of the Global South. It's a movement of peasants and indigenous peoples. And it's the way food's been grown in harmony with nature since forever. But they started calling it that and studying it. There are now thousands and thousands of peer-reviewed articles about agroecology, while there are still only in the hundreds of articles about regen ag. So, because it's a much older movement. And it's very much a grassroots movement. And it's one that saw that as agroecology became better known, governments and corporations started to say what they thought it was and what they thought it wasn't. And probably most people have some idea what happened to the organics movement when it became legislated in the US under USDA legislation. As soon as you got it into that kind of legislation for the standards, then again, the people with the lobbyists in those halls of power, they start watering down what the organic standards are. So what started as a social movement for organics became an industry for industrial organics. And obviously, there's still heaps of good organic growing, but it's a problematic space because the elites can control a lot of it. They saw that happening with agroecology and they said, we better go back to Mali. They went to Mali again. They spent another week deciding what agroecology is and is not. And I encourage you to read the second declaration, Nyeleni Declaration. Nyeleni is Nyeleni, on agroecology. And again, it's what the movements say agroecology is. It's a science, it's a set of practices, and it's a social movement. And you cannot take them apart. So one thing Raj Patel says is that food sovereignty without agroecology is just policy, and agroecology without food sovereignty is just technology. And you actually have to have the two of them working together, or it doesn't matter how much you're farming better. You know, the farmers who are losing access to Hardwick's abattoir in Victoria right now, or DBC in WA, or Cowra in New South Wales, or Booyong in New South Wales, or Craddock down here, they're farming better, but they're not going to be farming at all if they don't figure out how to change the policies that are making it very difficult to do what they do, and the ownership of all of our infrastructure to be able to do what we do. So I'm going to take through some distinctions then of incremental versus transformational changes. And I forgot my 15 principles sometimes, so I'm going to write them down. In terms of incremental principles principles that are incremental to changing the food system, that's something that both Regen Ag and agroecology are doing extremely well. Focusing on recycling, focusing on input reduction, soil health and animal health, biodiversity, synergy, and even economic diversification. You've got a lot more farmers who are growing more things, who are selling into more in different markets, you know, reducing their risk of selling only into one commodity market. So those things are happening across what you would call either Regen Ag or agroecology. Then you start to redesign your agroecosystems to get to the transformational changes. And the transformational changes, I would argue, are happening across a lot of Regen Ag-aligned spaces here, because we don't have the language of agroecology in this country. But we know that the corporates are trying to keep us down in the incremental space because they own the system. And so if they can own the language of Regen Ag, they'll control all of us right back out of it. They'll control our abattoirs, our grain mills, you know, wherever our markets are, the supermarkets, I mean, all of it, right? So to actually be transformational, you have to move into connectivity. Connectivity between farmers and eaters is critical to completely transforming the food system. The commodity chain is not doing that work. Co-creation of knowledge. This is a super big distinction between Regen Ag and agroecology. Although farmer field days, I think, are very common around Australia and other places, and farmers are doing a lot of that co-creation of knowledge, it also, because of that elite capture and the lack of a movement constantly defending what it is, there's just a huge growth in an industry of consultants and new input suppliers, or what the academics who study all of this call just input substitution, which is better inputs, but still at the end of the day, you're buying them from someone else instead of doing them on your farm. But again, in Regen, what I know is that heaps are doing it on their farm, and others are still buying more in. Some are doing more field days and not horizontal knowledge sharing. Others are bringing in a lot of experts, often who are, you know, quite often they're still agronomists instead of farmers. I'd rather walk around a farmer's paddocks with them any day and get them to tell me what they've been observing around their farm than somebody to be skyhooked in as an agronomist to tell us about their incredible expertise in general about soil and grass. Social values and diets. So again, this is where you get away from commodity crops. You're talking about what people grow for people to eat, right? Whereas vast monocultures of anything are not really valuing social values and diets, or in too many cases, the land they're grown on. Fairness is really important in the system. How are we employing labor, if at all, in our farms? How much is reliant on our family labor? How many of us, like on our own farm, which I don't think I even mentioned. Yeah, that's my taller half sitting down over there, Stuart. We're farmers on Jarrah country up in the Central Highlands of Victoria, and we rely mostly on family and other resident labour. And we do that in a series of kinds of exchanges in relations with each other. And then when we don't have enough to exchange in relations, then we pay a wage as well. But we're always devaluing transactions and any kind of transactional way of farming or employing labor. We're trying to value relational ways where they get enduring tenure on the farm, for example, or more meat, meat in exchange for veggies instead of just everyone paying for things. The other two are land and natural resource governance. So farmers often don't get a say in how our land and natural resources and the infrastructure like abattoirs and grain mills are governed. And because we have movements, we have organizations that are identified as representing these constituencies of smallholders, we work very closely with government. Because of the abattoir situation, I have a meeting with the Minister for Ag a couple of days after I get back from Tassie, because we're not just an individual, we're a nationwide organization representing smallholders. And so we get to participate once you develop the legitimacy with each state. It's good having state-based legislation. It's also hard when you don't have strong leaders in every state to take on that work with your ministers and the policy work. And then the last thing is participation, which is, again, sort of related. Everyone gets to participate. If you want to be able to grow food, you should be able to grow food. And that comes back to land, which we know is the most critical barrier to most people becoming farmers, nowadays especially, is access to land. So something the Australian Food Sovereignty Alliance has been working on for about 5 years now is farming on other people's land. And it's a stopgap measure, in terms of land redistribution, but trying to help people understand how you can share land with other farmers, young farmers who couldn't otherwise afford it, like we do with Tumpinyeri Growers on our land, they're market gardeners. And we don't charge rent for that because it's in the kind of language of capitalism, that talks about us having capital and we should be able to extract value from our capital, which means actually extracting surplus value from the labor of young people. And we don't think that's right. Just because we're fortunate enough to own land doesn't mean we should be charging a rent from young farmers to then give to us to continue to live an easier life. That's how capitalism works, and we don't think it's fair. Somebody once said to me, but if I have a mortgage, don't you think it would be fair if I at least asked them to help pay my mortgage? Well, sure, if you're going to give them a piece of the land at the end, like it's a mortgage, right? Do they get some too? And if you think about it like that, even if you hadn't thought about it before, you go, oh, okay, I kind of see the fairness point, but you might have to go away and think about it a bit longer because it's not how we normally do things in this country. Again, I think that's a distinction. Agroecology being a movement of peasants and a movement of the global south where they've been fighting elites for a lot longer and more successfully to a certain extent, is a movement about justice for everyone, not just ourselves. We don't just get to have a better farm. We don't get to just have better food for ourselves in our own local community. If everybody's not benefiting from the improvements that we're making, then we're not doing a good enough job. I'm going to finish with some stuff about, I usually like to ask how many people in the group think you'd rather be an entrepreneur or a peasant? Hands up for entrepreneurs. Hands up for peasants. It's growing every time I do this. So entrepreneur, and then I usually get, can't you be an entrepreneurial peasant? And in the Australian lingo, that kind of makes sense, right? But entrepreneur is actually quite a new word. It's a French word that's only been around for about 100 years. And it goes to the heart of people living in capitalist systems for a very long time, but not having like an extractive or kind of power-mongering mindset, but trying to think about how to survive in these systems. And so entrepreneurs are renowned for taking on a project, taking on high risk, usually financial risk, in hopes of a return. And whether it returns or not is not, often they don't get a return on their risk for that investment. But the damage is mostly externalized to environment, animals, labor, others. So when entrepreneurs, even good-hearted ones, have a go at a really interesting startup, whether it's farming or in other industries, usually they're going to kind of come out of it at least intact, but they might have done a lot of damage along the way to the land and the animals and the workers that came along the ride with them. Peasants, on the other hand, don't have the entrepreneurial mindset they definitely are innovators. I think they're some of the world's best innovators alongside Indigenous peoples. Peasant literally means like person of the land. Paysan is where it comes from. And so they're people who feel a deep connection to the land that they care for. And their motivation is the self-reproduction of the farm and the family and the ecosystem that supports all of those things. And it's not a project. It's a way of life. It's a completely different mindset. It's not, and they take risks, but not at the expense of land and animals and the other workers in the systems. And what you also find between the two, the difference between entrepreneurs and peasants, is that an entrepreneur tends to have quite a neoliberal autonomy, right? So their autonomy is quite individual. It's about themselves and maybe their own family. whereas the autonomy of the peasant is deeply collective. It's really, it's interreliant, interdependent. They have to have a community working together to survive because none of us are an island and we're dependent on quite a lot of other things. We probably don't grow all of our own food. Very few people do. We need food from others. We don't, we rely on infrastructure that others might have that we need. People who maybe host the farmers market can help us with that. There's a lot of interdependencies as opposed to individual autonomy. But autonomy is really big for farmers. It's just we've got to decide which kind of autonomy we're seeking and which one's going to help us have a livable planet, or more likely, more to the point, future generations have a livable planet. So the way we get there in agroecology is through, and I have flashcards to make it easier because I didn't want to do a PowerPoint. Who does? So emancipatory agroecologies is something come up with by Geraldo and Rosset. So Omar Geraldo and Peter Rosset are long-term academics who've studied food sovereignty and agroecology. They've also, like Peter Rosset's one of the activists who's been staff for La Via Campesina for 20, 30 years. They're very committed activist scholars, and they have been watching the movement, studying what others are saying about our movements forever, and they came up with these principles of emancipatory agroecologies that help you determine whether it's, neoliberal or reformist, or actually going to help with emancipation for everyone. And what they came up with, there are political principles, and to achieve that, you have to question and transform structures, not reproduce them. So if it's just the same thing, you think about the rise of the new organic market in town. Is it the same kind of extractive model where they're just going to pay farmers that 60% and then they have to pay their bills, and they're just trying to do a good thing, bring more organic food to the system? So it's not that it's bad people doing this at all, but you're reproducing the system instead of going, how can we do this fundamentally differently? Technical principles, cultivating autonomy rather than dependency. That's such a key one. And farmers are so often sold more dependence because the skills in all of industrial society, not just farmers, have been outsourced for so long. Like on our farm, because we feed our pigs on waste stream feed, I had to become very knowledgeable about pig nutrition. But if we had just been feeding them pellets, I wouldn't have known much about their nutrition. So all these things that we bring back in-house, we reskill ourselves and we create autonomies rather than dependencies. The next one, they're not in any order, by the way. Economic principles, shaping economies based on use value rather than exchange value. And the example that I like to give of this one, that's the simplest for everyone to quickly go, oh yeah, I totally get that. Water markets. You don't even have to need the water to buy water allocations, hold them, and then sell them at a premium to someone else, while a farmer who really needed that water can't access it. That's another story playing out in Victoria right now. I don't know if you've heard on the ABC, Annie Smithers, who runs Du Fermier and Trentham up in our region. She just got done for taking a megaliter of water from her spring-fed 25 megaliter dam on her farm to grow her acre of vegetables for her 24-seater restaurant because she didn't have a license for extraction because it's all treated the same. And so she can't access the water rights because they're all owned. There's no one to buy them from. She's been talking to water brokers and nobody will sell it because they're all taken by people who are speculating in the water market. Organizationally, we strengthen organizations collectively, not individually, and I've already think I made that point. It's great to have strong personalities. I mean, I'm kind of one of them. It's great to have that out there advocating, but you can't have just that. You've got to have an organization. Even when somebody tries to say, Tammi, Jonas, can you help us with that? I go, yeah, AFSA can definitely help with that. And we help with that. And we keep identifying that there's a whole bunch of us, not just Jonai Farms or a couple of others. So working organizationally is really important. If you don't join AFSA by the end of this, you're a fool, but it's a matter for you. There's no reception. You might forget by the time you go home. We could send a reminder. Methodological principles. We build horizontal processes, not hierarchies. So this is another really important one for us about, like at all of our food sovereignty convergences, it's in our constitution, in fact, that we have to organize our gatherings democratically. We never do what we're doing here, actually, even though these are also valuable ways of getting information across. We always sit in a circle and we dialogue. And we might have somebody who kind of sparks an idea, but we assume that like probably there are people out here who know a lot more than I do about some of the things I've been talking about. And hopefully there'll be enough. We're leaving enough time at the end. Ellie, we've got plenty, don't we? Yeah.
Yep, we've got 25 minutes from now.
Perfect. And I'm almost done. So we want to build our knowledge horizontally. Pedagogically, the same thing, building capacity to struggle and transform rather than conform. That comes out of Paulo Freire, who wrote, oh my God, I just forgot the name of the book. Sorry? Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Sorry, I was in Illich, Deschooling Society. So he talks about the banking system of education, where you just you bank the knowledge and hope you get a return on it in the future, which is how most of our education system is structured. He then goes to problem-solving education, where communities pose problems together to solve them together, so they're really active in their learning, instead of thinking you can just read the book or listen to the podcast and now I know how to go do that on my farm, or I know how to organize. Doing it together and talking it through, building agency together is much more powerful. And finally, philosophically, we act based on culture and spirituality rather than productivism. I mean, the most ironic thing about the productivist mindset in this country is how incredibly reductive it actually is, and how it's left the world eating 66% of what we eat comes from 9 crops. 2 major meat packers now control 54% of our market for processing. That's JBS and Tays. That's what productivism actually has got us. So if we go back to culture, community, interdependence, relationalism, then we actually start to repair the whole system. And that's certainly what we've been doing in the food sovereignty movement for the last 14 years. But we need more numbers because, again, a crowd is not a movement. And if you say you've got the money, but we've got the numbers, then you better have the numbers on the books. You can't walk in and say, I know they all agree with me. You need to actually have membership to drive that kind of change. And whether it's AFSA or other local organizations, join organizations and advocate together rather than alone. That's good, and let's go to discussion.
All right, so thank you, Tammi. We've got 25 minutes. I am under strict instructions to stop at 11:55 so that we can change over to the next session. And I'll get Tammi to repeat the question to the mics for the video. So we'll start with Felice.
Great, thanks.
Tammi, that was transformational. Without me having to go back and do another PhD, could you suggest 3 books that cover the principles? One of the embedded questions is whether your book has some of these ideas and knowledge in there. And also, is there a how-to guide? If you wanted to sell everything and set up a group and a collective to share land, how would you go about it? One step at a time to be doing it according to best principles of agroecology. Is there a how-to guide?
Yeah, great. So the question is, are there books to help with this transformation? And from the kind of bigger picture of how we achieve the transformation, but also locally, what if you wanted to build a collective and do this, right? So I'll answer the second one first, which is simply to say those local collectives have to come from relations. And in our land sharing discussions around the country, if people aren't already in relations, the risk of that land sharing agreement failing is very high. You need to know that you already are the same amount of messy or the same amount of tidy, the same amount of a lot of things. So you need to know that you're aligned enough in how you care for country to be able to form those sort of land-based agreements. You can't, I don't think advertising for the right person, we all know how intentional communities normally intentionally dissolve because it was well-meaning people who didn't already know if they were in the right relations. So that I think has to come from very, very place-based kind of work with your community. In terms of guides, my cookbook that I am selling here, because it's a fundraiser for the abattoir, it does actually have all of these principles in it. Every section of the cookbook starts with the politics of fat, the politics of sugar, the politics of pork, eggs, dairy. It's got it all. And it also goes through, it has something from the People's Food Plan, which the Food Sovereignty Alliance developed 14 years ago and then redeveloped last year. which is about grow, barter, buy kind of hierarchies. So it's got some things about how to think about your relationship to the food system, but not only as an individual, also as with your community and politically engaged with the government. That's all in the cookbook is actually an anarchist handbook disguised as a cookbook. So the recipes are quite good though. So, and the photos are very beautiful. So I recommend it.
Is that being sold at the bookstore?
Yeah, it's over here at the bookshop and it's $75. There's no reception. We're going to have to trust that you're going to pay ID when you leave, but we're very trusting people.
5 bags of coffee.
And sorry, there's one other book I would also recommend in terms of agroecology. It's a downloadable PDF. It's a very slim volume called AgroEcology, Science, Practices, and Social Movements or something like that. And that is by Peter Rossett. It's quite thin and it goes through everything from the agricultural practices through to the social movement aspect of it. It's a really, really good book.
We have a question from a young man here and then in the middle back.
Perfect.
How can we help the younger generation of farmers gain hope and respect for the farmland and older generation of farmers?
How can we help the younger generation gain hope and respect for the future farming and the older generation of farmers? Is that right? By being the best role models we absolutely can and doing what everyone here is doing to try to show a way to farm better and to do that together, thinking all the time about your generation and all those that come after you and talking about that. How what I'm doing on my farm now is going to benefit you and your kids and their kids. It's by all of us doing that and then also by working together to make sure the government lets us. That's how. That was a good question. I forgot to mention the other book, by the way. We only brought like half a dozen copies, but Farming Democracy tells the story of 8 small-scale farmers, including ours. We published it in 2019, I think it was. And it tells everything about how we produce, process, and distribute our food, including opening the books. Fat Pig Farm is in the book as well. And so it shows how much it costs us to farm and how much we earn from farming. And you can order that through the AFSA website if you don't get one of the 6 copies we brought. We had a baggage limit, so.
Here in the middle.
Thanks, Tammi. One of the things that I am working on is working with collectives of enterprises in places to kind of catalyse the shift to a more inclusive or agroecology style of economy. In the place that we're working, there is an abattoir that's kind of dormant. How would you go about applying agroecological principles together to bring that into smallholder hands, community hands? How can that be kind of community-led? What would you suggest?
So I will talk more about that. Sorry, the question. How would we apply kind of agroecological principles to a smallholder-led project, particularly around the abattoir, if it could be revamped, but also the smallholders working together more broadly as well? Yeah, so I'll talk more specifically about abattoir stuff tomorrow in my session called Where Have All the Abattoirs Gone? I've been paying, as a former vegetarian, I know a lot about abattoirs, but some of those principles I think are that we certainly are finding with building the micro abattoir at our farm and helping a lot of others. We'll be in the Northwest helping another community in a few days. You need to not take on debt. That's actually one of the key things. So finding ways to do these things without debt. Debt is killing all the abattoirs, even the big ones. Like there's such a slim margin. They can't survive. They don't cope with the fluctuations in the price of the inputs or labor if they have to service the debt no matter what happens. So avoiding debt at all costs or keeping it as minimal as possible. And that blows people's mind at first in a country where everything's expensive and what else do you do? But like we've raised $147,000 without taking on debt by self-publishing a cookbook, by hosting a dinner and a raffle that raised $37,000. And that brought us into even better relations with our community. So debt is really critical to that process. And then also setting up a governance structure for those smallholders to make sure they all feel that they have an equal right to participate and have a say. And yeah, knowing how to make sure you do have some organic leaders within that space who already understand governance better. When you talk about being democratic, you also want to be sure that those who understand stuff in terms of governance in particular have a strong voice, but not to speak over others, just to make sure you get your processes better down. And I'm super happy to have a further conversation about that, by the way. Yeah. Yeah.
I wanted to know, what is your like agroecological utopia? Like, what does it look like at like a community level, like and a domestic level for Australia, and then globally? Like, how do you picture that? Because obviously at the moment it looks nothing like that
Yeah.
at all, and it would take a lot of change to get to anywhere close to that.
Yeah.
So I guess, and like, how do you picture, like, where would you go completely agroecology or kind of in the middle, or yeah?
Yeah, no, I mean, the vision, and food sovereignty and agroecology do have a vision. And I think in the Australian context, at the local level, it looks exactly like what we're doing on our farm, which includes imperfections we're still trying to nut out. Where are we still having to be transactional rather than relational? And is that an important part of the system that will remain an important part of the system? Actually, I can give another example, like paying the rent is a transaction, and we want to be in relations, but we needed to start doing something before we could come into relations. And so just constantly applying ourselves to these questions and how to be better anti-capitalists is, and we eat very well, and we have a really joyful community, and our animals are treated well. So like, I think that what happens there, and at some other farms like ours, I think that's the vision for the local farming version, and you're sharing land, you're not hoarding land and all of that. When you take that to the cities, it's a much harder ask of what that looks like. Our cities we're overpopulated. The entire world has been fleeing rural areas at the advice of aid agencies and governments. And rural poor actually can live a lot better than urban poor because they can still grow their own food. And so when we hear those stats about like they only live on $1 a day, dollar a day when you can grow your own tomatoes and lettuce is actually fine in Africa. $1 a day in their cities is horrendous. That's a terrible life. So cities, I said I'm not a Maoist. I'm not going to send everyone back to the countryside, but wouldn't it be great if everyone lived in the countryside? It's a much harder ask. I mean, there's a whole bunch of urban policy, and there are organizations doing more work on kind of urban agriculture and how to green cities more. And some cities are doing that better in Europe, certainly than we are here. So I think that it's kind of an incremental way in a better direction, but it comes back to local governance again. So having local communities have a say, there's vacant area. How could we turn that into community gardens? How could we have more exchanges of the foods that we're all producing in our backyards? How can we facilitate more grassroots relations and less government top-down policy around food and agriculture? And it certainly doesn't involve multinationals owning most of the system. You know, like you would just, if you achieve the agroecology vision tomorrow, you'd overturn that tomorrow. You'd say, sorry, JBS, Kilcoy, Taze, oh, you guys, you're out of here. We're taking our infrastructure back. And that might sound wild, but they've done it in plenty of countries. So I'm going to keep saying it until it comes true before I die.
For those of us, I mean, you talked about action, and you know, we meet here and then where do we go? For those of us who own land, you know, who'd like to make it, I mean, I'm not really up to starting a collective. You mentioned that it's pretty damn hard. I mean, is it, should we be looking out and thinking that there's a couple of young people there, we'd like to give you this, we'd like you to do, you know, a small business there, we're not, you know, that, is it a good idea?
Yeah.
How do we go about it?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's it. So the question is, if you own land, like how could you go about bringing some young people in? Is it the right thing to do? If you're not going to start a full collective, what about just saying, I've got some space for you. What's this going to look like for us going forward? So I heard a really encouraging example of that when I was in, I'm going to forget the name of the town, Dungog in New South Wales. And there's an older farmer whose kids are independently wealthy and don't want to move back onto their farm. And so there were two young would-be farmers who he had got to know, and they formed a relationship, and they're now living on his farm. They're farming on his farm, and they are each year they own another 10%. He hands over another 10% of ownership of the farm until they reach 50%. At which point, I think they stop, because I think when he dies, that 50% needs to be bought out. I don't think it's a complete 100%. I could be wrong. I can't remember this part now. But it's given them access to land they would not have had. It's it's in the Hunter Valley. It's a really expensive area to get onto land. And they're helping run an organic collective with some other farmers in the area. So they're in relations with lots of others. It's given the older farmer like a new lease on his farm and life because he's got people there growing food. And they did it slowly. They did it by knowing each other first. Those farmers the young farmers would be in their early 30s. But they're from farming families. And so they're just like, they want to farm. And they came up with an agreement about what they agreed couldn't happen on the land. They had to basically follow agroecological principles to be able to do that. So I think that is the way. But it's like, is there a young person already in your district that you reckon might be interested? Or do you have some other young people that might know one?
Well, I have children that aren't independently wealthy, but they're following their own, at the moment in the city. So I'm not in a position to say, look, you can take, 50% of this farm because I don't think it would be fair. So am I exploiting a young person if I'm not offering them ownership in the end?
Well, in our case, Tumpinyeri Growers have been offered secure tenure. So they won't own the farm at the end. But if we die, they're not to be kicked off. They're there. And the Food Sovereignty Alliance is also working on an agrarian trust. And if we get this up, one of the things we're really interested in is farms like ours, putting our farm into the trust that gives the farmers who are on it secure tenure. But it can't be taken out of farming. So your kids couldn't ever take it and sell it so it's not farming anymore. And we're interested in doing that for our own kids, like even though ours are farming, so they're going to probably stay.
Didn't I see, Tammi, on the AFSA website, like a land use agreement template?
Yeah, we have in the FUPL section of the website, Farming on Other People's Land, there's a land use agreement, land sharing agreement there. It's a template. And then also whenever anybody asks, we just send ours, which is a version of that. Oh, ours is also on our website, actually. I put it up a few months back.
Helen?
There's also the business incubator model, so where you actually it might be just for a short time while they build up their own capacity to go and farm somewhere else. But you can get young farming started in an enterprise on your farm.
Yes, so the comment was there's a farmer incubator option there as well, to be able to get farmers, give them a few years or something to start up and then be able to move on to a more permanent solution. And there's is it the Kindling Trust in the UK does something like that? But they then have further property. So they start in the incubation and then they move on to something more permanent because they've secured land. So, and they're all market gardeners, I think.
I've got a question if there aren't more forthcoming just now. I mean, you've kind of touched on this a few times, but, we're so far away from the agroecological vision in a lot of the system. How do you think about meeting people where they're at and getting people to where we hope they get to, or getting the system to where we hope it will get to?
I mean, it's my whole life's work, Ellie. So by sharing these ideas more broadly, by normalizing the idea of sharing and being in relations rather than transacting everything, and by, spending literally 60 to 80% of my time lobbying government to make what we're all doing easier as part of an organization. But I don't buy into incrementalism as like we can't stop there. And incrementalism every time gets re-co-opted. That's the problem. It doesn't matter if our everyday farmers on the ground are actually doing a good job. They take it back every time. They take back control of the system. They go, I know you've been making your biofertilizer, but I've got a pretty cheap one. It's not cheap for long. And they do it every time. So until you transform the relations in the system and who owns what. So Livia Campesina says a question about who produces the food, who do they produce it for, how do they produce it, and what do they do with the surplus? These are really important questions to understand who we want producing food for whom, in what way, and what are we going to do with the surplus? If we have a surplus, is it going to get dumped on Sri Lanka so their farmers don't get to keep farming? Or are we going to say, oh, they're hungry people in our community. Let's feed them some of our surplus and let's try not to grow so much surplus because that's stupid, right? That's how we do it. Pickle it, yes. Yep.
Can you tell me where the term came from?
Yeah, so it's actually quite an old term from the 30s. And in fact, it was an agronomist who came up with the term. Sorry? Oh, sorry. Where did the term agroecology come from? So it was Benin Basil in Mexico coined the term around the time of the Green Revolution. But then as the reaction to the Green Revolution started in Mexico, the smallholders took the term and ran with it and said, you're farming in an ecosystem, so let's talk about agroecology.
Because in California, in the University of California in Santa Cruz,
Yes.
actually had a major
Yeah.
called agroecology. Run by
I think they still do.
I think they do.
Yeah, and Stephen Gleisman, who wrote the major text on it, is there as well. Mewa Montenegro DeWitt is there. Like, there's amazing scholars on agroecology in California, and that's the thing about the term too. So in the Spanish-speaking world, agroecology is used for everything. You know, from Regen Ag through agroecology, they just use agroecology. But that's what's made it kind of a weakness, because the things that are in that more neoliberal space can be called agroecology because they don't have a separate word for it. So it's actually helpful to us in a way that we could say, well, if the corporates are stealing Regen Ag, we've got agroecology, and then we're part of a hundreds of millions of people-wide movement, as opposed to being associated with corporations like Nestle and Fonterra, who are calling themselves regenerative, you know? And I would just caution against defining these things in any way other than movement meetings. Like governments, you don't want them to have your definition. You don't even want these things in legislation usually. As soon as they're legislated, the powerful lobbyists can go in and determine what they'll be. If you keep them out, James C. Scott, a famous anthropologist who passed away recently, he said the job of the peasant is to remain out of the archives. I'm obviously failing at that, but we are trying to keep these things out of the archives. We don't want to be so legible to the government that they over-legislate us.
Oh, we do have some final questions. Probably these two questions. So one here first and then Jake.
Thank you again. Thinking about local food systems, we're lucky enough in the Huon Valley to have a network of crop swaps, which is pretty great. We've struggled to get food hub type ideas off the ground. Partly everyone's busy and they're trying to just keep their own lives running. What do you think a next step can be? Like, the crop swap model has been wonderful, but it doesn't reach a lot of people. It doesn't reach a lot of people. So where do we go from here?
Yeah, so the question is, crop swaps have been great, but they don't reach everyone, and attempts at a food hub have been kind of fledgling and not quite got there, which is happening all over the country. It's happened in America, but again, in America, where they got the food hubs going, they've been pretty much sort of taken over by corporate interests as well. You know, it's because they look at large-scale aggregation for public procurement. An article I just reviewed actually showed that farmer groups, they don't ask for aggregation to go into public procurement. None of the social movements are asking for that. NGOs and governments ask for that. Farmers, why would you want to be aggregated, have your food made invisible again, like unidentifiable, be paid less for it, and go through the bureaucratic red tape of, you know, making it the traceability, et cetera, all of that. So it's not an awesome way, which is where the Americans took food hubs, but that's not necessarily what you have to do with a kind of food hub. One that's owned by the community and run by the community and then made very visible to members of the community who might not otherwise be part of these kind of in-groups of local food system stuff, I think are valuable. One of my articles from the PhD is called The Intrinsic Infrastructure of Agroecology, and it actually has a whole review of the literature around those questions of what they call the infrastructure of the middle, which is what people call the value chain. We call it the value extraction chain. But there's a big lit review in there that will help you think through how does this work or not work. And again, it goes back to principles of fairness, participation, and being done by communities, not others.
Last question. Sorry, Helen. And then we'll have to wrap up.
Okay.
Yeah, just quickly, Tammi, I really appreciate your talk. But in terms of like at a peasant level, we're talking about relational value, and let's exclude the governance stuff for a minute and bureaucracy and everything else. But like that relational value and the difference between skepticism and cynicism. So like, what's the resistance or some of your thoughts maybe to shine a really positive conclusion on this about trust in humanity. And like, let's take that little leap of faith and have trust in that younger person or another business partner, and we're going to work together, knowing that even if it fails, what's the consequence? You know, like what's stopping, or what's your thoughts on taking those little leaps of faith and actually trusting humanity and our fellow peasants and working together at, you know, in the face of fear.
Yeah.
Like, where's our trust in humanity and each other? And let's just start taking that leap.
If you can, repeat
Really
that
quickly.
question.
Yeah, I know. So how do we overcome our skepticism and cynicism to actually trust each other and work together in a system where there's a lot of fear and mistrust because we've been separated and disconnected by so many things and taught to compete, right? So for me, I guess that journey started when we got to the farm, probably earlier. I'm a very trusting person in spite of all evidence sometimes. We started by things like putting financial information out into the world, or going on Radio National and sharing that we were castrating our pigs. The vegans loved that. And trusting that enough people would actually go, these are things we don't talk about. I want to start talking about that too. Writing that book, Farming Democracy, you know, and putting all our financials into a book and then sending it out into the world, helping other farmers go, okay, it's okay to talk about the finances then. So I think it's baby steps. I think it's demonstrating that trust so others think they can too. Like me saying, pay ID doesn't work here. The books are over there. Make sure you pay me later. I should put the pay ID number on it probably, shouldn't I, Stuart? Yeah, thank you.
All right, well, thank you so much. Can everyone just give a round of applause?
Thank you.
For Tammi?